If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The frontier outpost stood at the northern edge of the empire, a stone block built less for comfort than for survival. Its walls were scarred by years of winter storms, and its courtyard smelled of damp wood, wet leather, and the smoke of the garrison fire that rarely went out. Inside the hall, soldiers and townsfolk gathered for the evening meal. Long tables ran the length of the chamber, planks darkened by grease and time. The air was heavy with boiled barley, onions, and cheap wine. At the center, legionaries ate together, their armor stacked at their feet, voices carrying the weariness of men who had marched across too many provinces. To the side sat local merchants, traders, and a few craftsmen who had been allowed into the outpost for shelter. But one woman, known among the garrison as a provincial outsider, had been given no place at the tables. She sat instead on a low wooden stool near the wall, close to the draft of the doorway. Her name was Livia, daughter of a farmer who had died in a fever years before. Her mother had been taken by the same sickness. With no surviving family, she worked as a washerwoman for the outpost and sometimes mended tunics when permitted. Her usefulness was tolerated, but her presence was not respected. Some called her unclean because she had come from a village struck by plague. Others simply despised her poverty. Tonight was no different. A serving boy pushed her away from the bench when she tried to sit, muttering that she did not belong. She had not argued. She lowered her head and accepted the stool, though the sting of humiliation pressed hot against her throat. Across the room sat Marcus Vero, a veteran legionary. His service had taken him from the eastern deserts to the forests of Germania. His face bore a long scar down his jawline, and his right shoulder carried an old wound that ached in cold weather. Once, he had commanded a century, but after a failed campaign and too many comrades buried in foreign soil, he had been transferred to this outpost. Among the men, he was known for his silence. He rarely joined in their laughter, and he kept his thoughts to himself. His duties were simple now: guard the frontier, drill the younger soldiers, and wait for orders that never seemed to change. That evening, Marcus noticed Livia sitting apart, her shoulders tight, her hands folded around the wooden bowl in her lap. He saw the way others avoided her gaze, the way the merchants looked past her as though she were part of the wall. His own food sat before him, bread torn from a rough loaf and a bowl of grain stew. For several minutes, he ate without comment, his thoughts circling the same questions that had haunted him for years. Why he was still alive when so many others were not. Why silence had become easier than words. Yet as he watched the woman near the doorway, he felt a stirring of unease. He knew what it was to be set apart, to carry marks others would not forgive. She was not a soldier, not bound by oath, but her isolation mirrored his own. He looked down at his meal, then back at her. The decision formed not from duty, but from a quiet sense that no one should eat alone under the eyes of mockery. Marcus rose. The bench creaked as he stood, drawing a glance from one of the younger men. He ignored it. He carried his bowl across the hall, each step steady, deliberate. Conversation faltered, a few heads turning. He did not address them. He set his food down before Livia and lowered himself onto the same stool beside her. Livia froze. Her chest tightened with alarm. Why would a legionary sit with her, in full view of the hall? She kept her eyes down, afraid of provoking anger, afraid of drawing more shame. Yet when she finally glanced at him, she found no scorn in his face. His expression was calm, unreadable but not hostile. He did not speak to her, nor did he look for approval from the others. He simply began to eat, beside her, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. For a moment, she felt the weight of every gaze pressing on her, but slowly the hall turned back to its noise. She raised a piece of bread, her hand trembling slightly, and ate. The bread tasted no different, yet for the first time in weeks, it did not feel like swallowing stones. Inside, she felt both relief and fear. Relief at being treated as human, fear of what punishment or gossip might follow. Marcus, however, sat unmoved, his thoughts steady. He had chosen, and he would not rise until he was finished. The hall buzzed with whispers, but none dared confront him. And so, in silence, two outcasts ate together, their separate worlds crossing for the first time. The whispers that had filled the mess hall the previous night did not vanish by morning. Men carried them into the courtyard. Merchants carried them into the market stalls, and servants repeated them by the well. A legionary sitting with a provincial woman. This was not a small act. It unsettled the order that kept the garrison balanced between strict hierarchy and fragile custom. Some wondered aloud if Marcus had been punished for it. Others muttered that he had gone soft. But no one confronted him directly. His reputation as a veteran with scars of command made silence the safer choice. For Livia, the memory of that moment had not faded when dawn broke. She woke in the narrow corner she rented near the storerooms, her thin blanket stiff with cold, and her thoughts turned again to the previous evening. She had eaten without shame for the first time in years. But the fear returned with the light of day. What would they say of her now? Would she be sent away from the outpost, cut off from the only place that gave her work? She washed the soldiers' tunics as usual, her hands red from the icy water, but her heart carried the weight of doubt. The day passed in routine. Soldiers drilled in the yard, their boots kicking up mud, their shouts echoing off the stone. Marcus oversaw the younger recruits, correcting their stances with short, sharp words. He gave no sign of distraction, yet more than once his gaze shifted toward the storeroom doorway, where Livia came and went with baskets of linen. He noted how others avoided her, how she kept her head low to pass unnoticed. He remembered her trembling hand when she had lifted the bread, and he recognized the same tension he carried himself, the constant expectation of being judged. That evening, when the hall filled again, Livia hesitated at the door. She had no desire to draw more stairs, but her work left her hungry. She stood for a long moment, torn between entering and retreating. She thought of her father, who had once told her that survival was not about pride but about endurance. She stepped inside. Her feet carried her to the same low stool against the wall. The hall buzzed as if nothing had changed, though she could feel eyes turning toward her. Marcus sat among the soldiers at the center table. He ate in silence, ignoring the crude jokes that passed between the younger men. When his bowl was half empty, he rose without a word, as he had the night before. This time the stares came sharper, the whispers louder. But again, he crossed the room, set his food before her, and sat beside her on the stool. Livia's chest tightened. The fear was sharper now because it was repeated, no longer an accident, but a choice. She lowered her voice and whispered, "You should not do this." Marcus looked at her, his expression steady. "I sit where I choose." His tone carried no heat, no plea, only fact. Then he turned to his meal. The hall shifted back into its rhythm, though quieter than before. For Livia, the food tasted different once more, not because of flavor, but because of the absence of humiliation. Still, her thoughts ran restless. Why him? Why would a soldier risk being marked for breaking custom? Did he see her as pitiable or as something else? She did not know, and she dared not ask. Later that night, when the hall had emptied, Marcus left his cloak again over the stool. This time she followed him to the doorway, holding it out. "You forgot this." He paused. His eyes met hers, the scar along his jaw stark in the torchlight. "Keep it," he said. Then he walked into the courtyard, his steps steady, his back unbent. She held the cloak in her hands, its weight heavy, its wool rough against her skin. Her first thought was suspicion, that there was some hidden motive that he would ask something in return. But as she stood alone, she realized he had asked for nothing, not even thanks. The unspoken question that lingered in the minds of the others: why had a veteran soldier chosen to sit with a provincial woman branded as unclean, was the same question that now turned in Livia's heart. And though she had no answer, she felt a change. For the first time since her family had died, she was not entirely alone. The next days unfolded with the same routine that bound the outpost to its narrow rhythm. Drills at sunrise, patrols in the hills, repairs to the walls and ditches, the gathering of firewood in the damp forest beyond. Yet beneath the surface of routine, tension grew. The act of Marcus sitting with Livia had not been forgotten. Among the younger legionaries, it became the subject of muttered jokes, and among the townsfolk, a suspicion that the woman who had once been scorned was being lifted to a place she did not deserve. Livia felt the weight of every stare when she walked through the courtyard. She kept her eyes down, clutching baskets of linen against her chest as if they could shield her. More than once, she heard fragments of words, unclean, witch, cursed village. Each phrase struck like a stone. At night, when she lay beneath her thin blanket, she worried that the commander might banish her from the outpost altogether, stripping her of the meager work that kept her alive. The fear gnawed at her, and though she held Marcus's cloak tightly when the cold set in, she could not understand why he risked being linked to her shame. Marcus, for his part, did not speak of it. He carried on with his duties, training recruits, inspecting weapons, checking the watch at the gates. But he noticed how the atmosphere shifted when she passed. He had lived long enough in the ranks to know what suspicion could become. Soldiers who felt powerless looked for an enemy close at hand. In the deserts, it had been local tribes. In the forests, it had been hidden raiders. Here, it might be a woman who could not defend herself. The first open challenge came at the well. Livia bent to draw water, her hands stiff from cold, when two merchants stepped in her path. One of them, red-faced from wine, spat on the ground. "You drink first. The rest of us will sicken," he muttered. The other laughed, shoving the bucket from her hands so that it tipped, spilling water into the mud. The laughter spread to a pair of recruits nearby. Her heart pounded. She wanted to protest, to say that she had done nothing, but the words caught in her throat. She felt again that same cornered helplessness she had known as a child, when her village had burned from fever and she had been left behind. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bucket. Marcus's voice cut across the yard, low but carrying. "Enough." He stepped forward, his shadow falling across the well. The recruits stiffened, dropping their smirks. The merchants drew back, uneasy under his gaze. Marcus picked up the bucket and set it upright, then held it steady as Livia pulled the rope. He said nothing else, but his presence was unmistakable. When the bucket filled, he carried it for her to the edge of the courtyard and set it down without ceremony. Livia's throat tightened with both relief and shame. She whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear, "You should not have done that." He looked at her briefly. "You should not stand alone." Then he turned back to the soldiers, leaving her with the bucket. That night, as she washed tunics by the brazier, the memory returned again and again. No one had ever stepped between her and cruelty since her parents died. The sensation unsettled her as much as it comforted her. Did she owe him gratitude? Did he expect something in return? She wanted to ask, but each time she saw him in the hall, sharpening his blade or checking the straps of his armor, she kept silent. The men, too, were unsettled. A few whispered that Marcus had taken pity on her, others that perhaps he had been cursed by her touch. Yet no one dared confront him directly. His silence and scars shielded him as surely as armor. Still, Livia wondered at the risk. Why a man who had seen battle and loss would choose to share his strength with someone who had nothing to offer. She found no answer, but she noticed a shift inside herself. When she carried baskets across the yard, she no longer walked as if waiting to be struck. She walked knowing someone had once stood at her side. And though she did not yet understand it, the first threads of belonging had been drawn between them. The days after the confrontation at the well carried a new tension through the outpost. The open challenge had been silenced by Marcus's presence, but silence did not erase suspicion. Men still watched Livia as she passed, their voices dropping when she entered a room. For her, each step through the courtyard remained heavy with unease, yet something had shifted. She no longer felt entirely exposed. The memory of Marcus standing beside her, steady and unyielding, gave her the strength to continue her work without breaking. The garrison was not a place where kindness was often shown, and so every gesture gained weight. When Marcus came to the fire after his evening duties, she found herself lingering with a basket of tunics, washing them longer than needed. She was not certain why she stayed. She told herself it was safer to work by the warmth of the brazier rather than return to her cold corner too soon. Yet the truth was harder to admit. She felt less invisible when he was near. Marcus sharpened his blade as he always did, the scrape of the whetstone steady, almost rhythmic. For years, the routine had calmed him, a habit carried from campaign to campaign. But now, when he looked across the flames, he saw her bent over the water tub, her hair damp from the steam, her movements precise. He did not speak, and she did not ask. Yet the silence between them began to feel less like emptiness and more like recognition. The others noticed. A recruit muttered to another that the washerwoman had bewitched him. A merchant whispered that Marcus must be desperate for companionship to sit with a peasant. But when the commander walked past and saw Marcus at his post, duties carried out without fault, no punishment came. Marcus was too valuable to the garrison, too proven to be disciplined for something so small. One evening, when a soldier collapsed from fever, Livia was summoned to help. It was her skill with washing and boiling cloth that had made her useful before, but now it was her patience. She sat at the young man's side through the night, cooling his brow with damp rags, forcing water between his lips. Marcus stood at the door for much of that night, watching. He said nothing, did not interfere, but when the boy's fever broke at dawn, he carried the heavy bucket of water for her without needing to be asked. She looked at him with weary eyes, uncertain how to thank him, and he only gave the smallest nod. Questions that had been unspoken in earlier chapters of their story now became clearer. Why was Livia still tolerated in the outpost despite being labeled unclean? The truth was practical. There were too few who would take the hard task she accepted without complaint. And why was Marcus, a man once a commander, sent to this remote post? The soldiers whispered the details, that he had been demoted after a campaign gone wrong, that he carried the blame for men lost in an ambush he could not prevent. Neither spoke of their pasts, but the weight of them was visible in the way they carried themselves. She with bowed shoulders that still refused to break, he with scars that explained his silence more than words ever could. By late winter, a kind of rhythm emerged. She tended the fires in the hall, her hands rough from wood and ash. He sat nearby, sometimes helping mend straps or grind blades. She did not ask him why he stayed close, and he did not ask her why she offered bread when she had little to spare. But the pattern was noticed by all. They were no longer two figures apart, but two who moved in quiet step. Livia felt conflicted. She knew the whispers had not ended. She knew at any time the commander might order her away, especially if food grew short. But each day she survived beside Marcus brought a fragile sense that her life was no longer only endured. There was someone who had chosen to sit with her, not once but many times, and that choice gave her the strength to stand straighter when others tried to look through her. And for Marcus, though he spoke little, the act of standing watch beside her or carrying a bucket on her behalf was more than habit. It was a decision he repeated, one that steadied the restlessness that had haunted him since the wars. He did not tell her that in her endurance he saw the echo of the comrades he had lost, the same quiet refusal to surrender to despair. He did not know if she understood it, but when he looked at her across the fire, he no longer felt as though he carried the silence of exile alone. That winter, in a garrison worn by hunger and suspicion, the sight of a legionary and a provincial woman sitting by the fire without words became part of the daily life of the outpost. No declaration was made, no promise given, but a bond had begun to hold, strong enough that even the whispers could not break it. Spring returned to the frontier in slow steps. The snow melted into thick mud that clung to boots and wheels alike. The river swelled with icy water, and supply caravans arrived late and half empty. The outpost endured as it always had, built on discipline and suspicion, yet small shifts in routine did not go unnoticed. One of those shifts was the presence of Marcus and Livia together, never loudly declared, never explained, but repeated until it became harder to ignore. By now the soldiers no longer laughed openly when she entered the hall, though the whispers had not ceased entirely. Some said Marcus shielded her because of guilt from his past. Others whispered of a debt or some hidden bargain. The truth was simpler, but harder to speak. He had chosen to remain beside her, and that choice unsettled those who depended on strict boundaries between soldier and outcast. Livia felt the strain every time she carried water through the yard. She had grown accustomed to silence, but silence in a crowd still cut deep. Yet she also carried something she had not possessed for years, a sense that she was no longer defenseless. Marcus had never spoken of protection, but his presence made it real. Each time he stood near her, men who might have mocked her looked away instead. She asked herself often why he continued, and whether she deserved such loyalty. In her private thoughts, she feared he might one day stop, leaving her more exposed than before. The change came one evening at the meal. The hall was crowded, the air thick with voices, smoke, and the sourness of thin wine. Livia entered as she always did, her steps careful, her head slightly bowed. She expected to take her place on the stool near the wall, as had become her habit, and for Marcus to cross to her later, as he always had. But this time, before she could move to the side, Marcus stood and gestured toward the bench beside him at the center table. The noise in the hall dulled. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. To sit at the soldier's table was to break a line unspoken but deeply guarded. She thought of the scorn that would follow, the commander's cold disapproval, and the risk of being cast out entirely. Yet Marcus did not lower his hand. His face remained calm, his eyes steady, as if daring anyone to challenge him. After a long moment, she walked forward and lowered herself onto the bench. The wood felt strange beneath her, too high compared to the stool, as though she had stepped into a place she did not belong. She kept her eyes on the table, her hands tight in her lap. Marcus passed her half of his bread without a word. Around them, men muttered, but none rose to confront him. His authority, born from years of scars and silence, carried weight even in rebellion. The commander noticed. He paused in the doorway, gaze fixed on the pair. For a moment, Livia thought the order would come, harsh, final, ending what fragile place she had found. But after a long silence, the commander turned away. Marcus had not broken discipline in his duties, and the garrison needed his steadiness more than it needed the comfort of old prejudice. The hall slowly returned to its noise, though sharper, more uneasy. For Livia, the moment was overwhelming. She could hardly taste the bread. Fear knotted inside her. Fear that she had stepped too far, that she would pay for daring to sit among men. But alongside the fear came something else, a flicker of dignity she had thought lost forever. For years she had eaten on the margins, reminded with every glance that she was less than the others. Now, with one simple gesture, Marcus had shifted her place. That night, she lay awake in her narrow corner, the rough wool of his cloak pulled tight around her. Questions chased through her mind. Did he see her as more than a burden? Was this pity, or something else he had no words for? She did not know, and the uncertainty frightened her as much as it steadied her. Yet she could not deny the truth. She was no longer the woman who had been pushed to a stool at the edge of the hall. She had been asked to sit at the table, and she had taken the seat. For Marcus, the decision had been deliberate. He knew the risk, knew the looks that followed him, but he also knew the price of silence. He had once obeyed without question, once looked away when injustice was done to those with no power. He had buried too many men who had trusted the wrong silence. This time, he had chosen differently. And so, without speeches or promises, the bond between the scarred legionary and the provincial woman was sealed in the eyes of the garrison. What began as a single act of defiance had grown into something the outpost could no longer ignore. The weeks that followed the night she sat at the table were uneasy but decisive. The garrison adjusted in silence, as soldiers always did when something could not be changed. At first, the stares followed Livia everywhere, sharp and lingering. But when Marcus continued his duties without faltering, when his voice carried across the yard drilling recruits as firmly as ever, the whispers began to fade. It became routine to see her near him, at the fire in the evenings, in the hall at meals, sometimes in the courtyard when he checked the patrols. What had once been scandal became part of daily life, tolerated because the commander had chosen not to forbid it. For Livia, the change was difficult to trust. She still woke in the night, expecting to be cast out, still carried the memory of humiliation like a scar. Yet each day that passed without punishment, each meal shared openly in view of others, carved away a piece of that fear. She began to stand taller when she carried her baskets, to meet the eyes of those who once dismissed her. The strength was not loud, but it was steady. She was no longer only surviving. She was living among them, with a place she had not thought possible. Marcus saw the difference. He noticed when she no longer flinched at every whisper, when her hands no longer trembled as she ate beside him. For a man who had lived years in silence, watching life pass without allowing it close, the sight stirred something he had not expected to feel again. She was not a soldier, not bound to him by oath, but she had endured as steadfastly as any comrade he had lost. That resilience anchored him in a way duty alone never had. The question many wondered, but few dared ask, was whether Marcus would remain if orders came for him to march again. Rumors of reassignment passed through the ranks as spring lengthened into summer. Livia heard them, too, and though she tried to hide it, the thought of his departure struck fear deep into her chest. If he left, would she be pushed back to the margins, stripped of the fragile belonging he had given her? She did not ask aloud, but the question followed her each day. The answer came one morning in the courtyard. The commander announced that a detachment would be sent east, and Marcus's name was among them. Men began preparing gear, sharpening weapons, and packing rations. Livia kept to her tasks, folding linen and carrying water, but inside she felt the return of that familiar hollow, the same emptiness she had known when her parents were taken. She braced herself to lose what she had just begun to believe in. Marcus packed slowly. His armor, worn but serviceable, lay on the bench before him. His travel cloak was folded neatly, his pack half filled. He tied the straps with careful hands, but his eyes were fixed not on the road ahead, but on the woman standing by the well, her head lowered as she rinsed cloth. He thought of the nights spent in silence, the bread shared across the table, the quiet strength she had shown when the garrison turned against her. He thought of the years he had lived moving from province to province, leaving behind graves and memories, never staying long enough for anything to matter. At last, he set down the pack and crossed the yard. The men looked up, expecting him to fall into line, but he did not. He stopped before Livia, who raised her eyes in confusion, her hands still wet from the water. "I stay," he said simply. The words were plain, but they carried the weight of a choice that defied years of obedience. The soldiers near the gate stared, some in disbelief, others in quiet understanding. The commander, watching from the steps, did not call him back. Marcus had served long and well. If he chose to remain, the outpost would not lose by it. For Livia, the words struck like a sudden warmth. She felt the tightness in her chest release, the fear she had carried since hearing the rumors dissolve into something steady and real. He was not leaving her to face the silence alone. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without dread of tomorrow. Life in the outpost did not transform overnight, but it changed enough. Livia continued her work, no longer avoided at the table. Marcus continued his duties, still quiet, still scarred, but no longer carrying his silence alone. The bond between them was not celebrated with feasts or songs. It became stronger than the walls of stone around them. In a place where survival had always been uncertain, they had found something rare, belonging. Their story did not end with exile or loss, but with a decision made in the courtyard of a forgotten outpost, that two people who had once lived apart from others would remain together. And in that choice, they discovered the one form of survival greater than endurance: staying.